The freezing rain was coming down in sheets, the kind of rain that doesn't care what it ruins, and my older brother Marcus was on his knees in the mud outside what used to be our family's home, crying in a way I hadn't known he was capable of. Two men in leather jackets were moving his suitcases out of the house with the efficient, unhurried energy of people for whom this particular scene is Tuesday. Marcus kept reaching for the handles and they kept shooting him further away from him. Not cruelly, just practical. The way you move things out of the way of a job you're trying to finish. My mother was on the front steps in her robe, screaming at a third man with a clipboard. Something about extensions and good faith, and the $3 million she absolutely did not have and had not had for some time. "We have nothing left," she shrieked. "You cannot do this to us. We are a good family. We pay our debts. We just need one more week." The man with the clipboard was not moved by this. He had heard variations of this speech before from better performers, and his face communicated that clearly without requiring him to say anything at all. I watched the entire scene from the heated leather back seat of my blacked-out Rolls-Royce, parked at the curb with the engine running and the warmth set to exactly the temperature I preferred, which was the kind of temperature you only get to choose when the decisions are entirely yours. I had a glass of water in my hand. Still, not champagne, not wine, just water because some moments don't require theatre. My driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, a question without words. I nodded. He pulled the car slowly, precisely, to the curb directly in front of the house. My mother stopped screaming to recognize the vehicle from the magazine spread that had apparently been the first indication to anyone in this family that something had gone very wrong with their plan. I watched her face do something complicated, something that moved through confusion and landed, finally, somewhere close to genuine fear. Marcus turned from the mud. He looked at the car, at the plates, at the tinted window that was, at that exact moment, beginning to roll down. The color left his face so completely and so fast that even in the rain, even from that distance, I could see it happen. I didn't say anything. I reached out into the rain, the cold hitting my hand for just a moment, and I dropped the paper I'd been holding. On my old cancer diagnosis, folded and creased from 5 years of sitting in a drawer where I'd put it after the clinic, called to say it was a false positive, crumpled at the edges from being carried in a pocket on the night I decided how this was going to end. It landed in the mud at my mother's feet. I rolled the window back up to understand why my brother was kneeling in the mud. My mother was looking at a piece of paper like it might be the end of the world. I have to take you back 5 years. But to the last day, I still believed blood was the same thing as family. I was 23 when I started sending money home. It began reasonably, the way these things usually do. Then my mother called one evening while I was still settling into my first real corporate finance job, 2 months in, still learning which coffee machine required which card, and she described a situation that sounded genuinely difficult, a bill that had arrived at the wrong time, a gap that needed bridging just this once. I bridged it, because she was my mother. And bridging it was something I could do, and the satisfaction of being able to help someone you love is a feeling worth having, at least the first time. The next month there was another gap, and the month after that, and at some point without a formal conversation or a conscious decision, 70% of my take-home pay was making the same journey every month, landing in a joint account my mother controlled, covering a life I wasn't living for a family I rarely saw. I told myself for years that they needed it more than I did, that Marcus was between opportunities, which was the phrase my mother used for a situation most people would describe differently, that the gaps would close eventually, that things would stabilize, that one day my mother would call to say things were better now and thank me for the years of bridging. That call never came. The gaps just got larger. By the time I was 28, I had a 6-figure salary, a tiny apartment I'd barely slept in, and a savings account I'd built from the 30% of my income I'd guarded like it was the only thing actually mine, because it was. My emergency fund, my future, the one part of my financial life that didn't have my mother's name anywhere near it. The diagnosis came on a Wednesday. I'd been coughing for 6 weeks, the kind of cough that starts as an annoyance and progresses into something you start timing, something you find yourself managing around meetings and phone calls, and a particular exhaustion of a body that hasn't had enough sleep in longer than you can accurately remember. The doctor was careful with her language. The specific, deliberate care of someone who has delivered difficult news many times and understands that the brain needs the information in small, navigable pieces rather than all at once. Early stage, she said. Fought early, which matters enormously. Good prognosis with the right treatment. The right treatment requires starting immediately. I sat in that office for a while after she left, looking at the paper in my hands. I thought about the savings account, about the years of 30%, about the one financial decision in a decade that had been entirely mine to make. And I thought, okay, this is what it was for. I drove to my parents' house that same afternoon. I heard the music before I got the door fully open. Thought the music of a household going about its evening, something louder, more deliberate, the bass of a celebration carrying through walls in a way that means it's been going on for a while and hasn't reached its natural ending yet. Marcus was in the living room. He was holding a set of car keys, tossing them lightly and catching them, the specific gesture of a man performing casualness for an audience he knows is watching. But my mother was beside him, still wearing the expression she gets when she's done something that required courage, a particular brightness around the eyes that I'd seen before but hadn't always understood correctly. On the driveway, visible through the front window, was a car that had not been there the last time I visited. Low, red, the unmistakable profile of something that costs more than most people earn in several years. I recognized the brand without needing to see the badge. "The Maya," my mother said when she registered me in the doorway, and the brightness in her eyes did something complicated. "You should have called. We're celebrating." "What is that?" I said, looking at the car. "The Marcus's new car," she said, with the specific, emphatic pride of someone who has given an extremely large gift and wants the giving acknowledged. "For his new investment firm. You can't launch a serious business in this city without the right image, you know that." I looked at Marcus. He was still tossing the keys. "Mom," I said, "I need to ask you something about my savings account." The brightness shifted. Just slightly. Something underneath it. We calculated it. "What about it?" she said. "I need to access it," I said. "I have a medical situation. It requires treatment, and I need the funds in my emergency account to cover the costs." My mother was quiet for a moment. "What account?" she said. I looked at her. "Mom," I said, "my emergency savings. The account we set up 3 years ago, where I deposited. That money's been used," she said. The sentence arrived without preamble, without apology, without any of the softening I might have applied to it if I'd been the one having to say it. "What do you mean used?" I said. "Marcus needed capital," she said, "for the launch. You know how important this is for the family, Maya. We needed to move quickly before the opportunity closed." "You need my signature to move money out of that account," I said. "I handled it," she said. 3 words. Flat, final, delivered the way you'd say you'd handled a minor administrative inconvenience that didn't require further discussion. "I have cancer, Mom," I said. "I just came from the doctor. I need that money for treatment." My mother sighed. It was not the sigh of a woman processing devastating news about her child. It was the sigh of someone who has been interrupted during something important by a complication they find tedious. "She's dying anyway," she said, to Marcus, not to me, as if I'd already left the room. Like, just ignore her. The money has to go toward the firm. I stood in that doorway for a moment, holding a cancer diagnosis in my hand, watching my mother turn back to her son and the conversation I had interrupted. Marcus was looking at me. He had, I noticed, stopped tossing the keys. He didn't say anything. The Relicious looked at me with an expression I couldn't fully read in that moment, something I catalogued and set aside, and only fully understood much later, after the misdiagnosis was corrected and I had time to think clearly about the specific sequence of everything that had happened in the week before that afternoon. "But get out," my mother said, still not looking at me. "You're ruining the evening." I left. I came back that night because I had nowhere else to go. My apartment was across the city. I'd taken a cab to the house and didn't have cash for another. My phone was at 4% battery, and the infection in my lungs, which I didn't know yet was only an infection, was making the cold feel like something physical and hostile pressing in from every direction. The lock didn't take my key. I stood on the front step and looked at the door for a moment, processing this information, and then I knocked. I knocked loud enough to be heard of the music which was still gunning inside, still the same bass, still carrying the specific warmth of a celebration that hadn't needed to end because the unpleasant interruption had been successfully removed. No one came. I knocked again. The religious puishnik with matmo but real, my voice cracking in the cold, coughing between words, telling them I was sick, that I needed to come in, that it was freezing outside and I didn't have anywhere to go. The music got slightly louder, which told me someone had heard me and made a decision about it. I sat down on the front step because standing had started requiring an effort I didn't have reserves for, and I put my back against the door they'd locked against me, and I coughed deeply for a long time and listened to the party going on inside the house my money had kept standing for 10 years. I don't know how long I sat there, long enough that the cold stopped being something I was fighting and started being something I was simply inside of, long enough that the music eventually dimmed. Not stopped, just turned down slightly, the way you turn down something you're still enjoying but wanted to let run quieter for a while. I thought about 10 years of 70%, about a savings account with my name on it and someone else's signature on the withdrawal, about a cancer diagnosis in my pocket and a door that no longer opened for me. And somewhere in that cold, somewhere in that specific combination of exhaustion and grief and the body's insistent desire to survive anyway, the last remaining piece of love I'd been carrying for that family simply stopped. Not dramatically, not with a decision I consciously made. It just went quiet the way a sound goes quiet when a source is removed, and the silence where it had been was so complete that I understood, sitting on that step, that it wasn't coming back. The free clinic 3 blocks away let me in at midnight. I slept on a cot in the room with 7 other people and woke up to daylight and a doctor I'd never met telling me I needed to stay for observation, that my lungs sounded bad, that they'd run some tests overnight and wanted to review the results before I went anywhere. I stayed. 3 days later, the same doctor came back. She was smiling in the specific way medical professionals smile when they are about to tell someone something genuinely good, which is a different kind of smile than the careful, managed expression they use for the other kind of news. "We got your records from your primary care physician," she said, sitting down across from me, holding a chart. "And we re-ran the biopsy markers." She set the chart on the table between us. "It's not cancer," she said. It was a respiratory infection, severe enough to produce markers that can sometimes be misread as early-stage malignancy. It happens. The original diagnosis was a false positive. I looked at the chart. "You're going to be fine," she said. "With the right antibiotics and some rest, you're going to make a full recovery." I sat with that sentence for a long time. "You're going to be fine." My family had spent my chemo money on a sports car because they believed I was dying. They had locked me out in the freezing rain, blocked my number, and thrown a party with my savings because they had decided my life was already over and the money might as well be useful. And I was going to be fine. I looked at the false positive diagnosis on the chart. Then I thought about the party inside the house, about the look on Marcus's face in the doorway, the expression I hadn't been able to read, that I was only now, lying in a clinic cot with a corrected chart in my hands, starting to understand. He hadn't looked guilty. He had looked like someone who had made a calculation and was watching it resolve. I thought about the timing, about the fact that I'd left my purse on the kitchen table 3 days before I came to ask for the money, when I'd stopped by briefly, just for an hour, and Marcus had been home alone, about the biopsy receipt in my wallet that I hadn't moved since the doctor's visit. He would have seen the medical codes on the receipt. He knew, or could have easily known, with a 5-minute internet search what they meant. And 4 days after that visit, my mother had emptied my account. I lay there in that clinic cot, and I put those pieces together very slowly and very carefully. The way you work through a financial model you need to be absolutely certain about before you present it. When I was done, I knew exactly what had happened. And I knew exactly what I was going to do about it. I reached for the chart, the false positive, the document that said I was alive when they'd written me off as dead. I folded it, put it in my pocket. Then I picked up the clinic's phone and called the one person I knew who understood, at a structural level, what it meant to build something that couldn't be traced back to you. "Mr. Vance," I said when he picked up, "I need to ask you something." "Mayor," he said, and I could hear the relief in his voice at the sound of mine because I hadn't called in 3 days and he'd apparently been concerned. "Are you all right?" "I'm going to be," I said. But I need you be," I said. "It's going to take a while to explain." "I have time," he said. "I need to die," I said. A pause. "Temporarily," I added. Another pause, shorter this time, telling me everything, he said. Mr. Vance had been my mentor for 3 years before the diagnosis, the kind of mentor who exists at the intersection of genuine brilliance and earned cynicism, a man who had built and lost and rebuilt enough times to have stopped finding the process surprising. He had made his first serious money in offshore corporate structuring, the legal kind, the kind that exists in the substantial grey area between tax efficiency and invisibility. He understood, better than almost anyone I'd met in a decade of corporate finance, how to build something that looked like one thing from the outside and was something else entirely at its centre. He also, critically, had resources and a particular abiding dislike for people who exploit loyalty for personal gain, which he had described to me once as the only genuine moral conviction he still carried from his youth. When I explained what my family had done and what I wanted to do about it, he was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I know exactly the kind of firm you're describing. I've helped build several of them for considerably less justified reasons." "Is it legal?" I said. "The firm itself is entirely legal," he said. "The contracts Marcus signs will be real contracts for a real financial product with real terms he agrees to of his own free will. What happens to his money after he wires it is a matter of where the contract's directed, which is, as it happens, wherever we decide, and the mob connection," I said. "That part," Mr. Vance said, "is Marcus's own doing. We simply need to make sure the opportunity looks exclusive enough that he decides to pursue funding through channels we don't need to arrange for him." I thought about Marcus tossing car keys in the living room, about the look on his face in the doorway when I told my mother I had cancer. "He'll do it," I said. "He's been performing wealth he doesn't have for years. If something looks exclusive enough, he'll find the money somehow. Then let's make it look very, very exclusive, Mr. Vance said. The death was quiet, which felt appropriate. I didn't stage anything dramatic. I simply stopped existing under my original name, the way a company stops existing when it's dissolved. Paperwork, process, records updated, the relevant parties notified through channels that reached everyone except the people I specifically didn't want notified. A distant cousin of Mr. Vance's, who worked in municipal records and owed him a favor from a decade earlier, helped ensure that certain documentation existed to support the conclusion that a woman matching my description had passed away in a charity care facility after a brief illness, unclaimed, no next of kin filed. The kind of death that happens to people nobody's looking for, which meant nobody looked very hard. From my mother, I was told later by a mutual acquaintance I'd kept in careful, minimal contact with, had received the news with what the acquaintance described as appropriate sadness. She'd apparently cried for 20 minutes, which the acquaintance seemed to find moving, and which I found notable mainly for its duration, which was 20 minutes more than she'd spent acknowledging my cancer diagnosis while I was still alive to receive acknowledgement. Marcus apparently had not cried at all. I noted that, filed it, moved on. The new name was simple, easy to say, easy to spell, easy to build a professional history around, with the right documentation and the right introduction into the right rooms. Mr. Vance handled the introductions. He was very good at introductions, the specific kind that happen in rooms with good lighting and expensive catering, where a person is positioned, before they've said anything at all, as someone worth knowing. I had always been competent in those rooms. Under the new name, with 3 years of corporate finance experience and the particular authority that comes from no longer caring what anyone thinks of you, I became more than competent. I became, in the circles that mattered for this particular purpose, exactly the kind of person you'd want running a highly exclusive, extremely selective investment vehicle. We incorporated Obsidian Holdings in 6 weeks, registered in a jurisdiction whose transparency requirements were, by design, minimal. Physical office in a high-rise, 12th floor, the kind of address that communicates seriousness without demanding too much scrutiny of what actually happens inside it. The portfolio materials were immaculate. Mr. Vance's design team spent 3 weeks on them, the specific 3 weeks required to make something look like it had accumulated weight and history over years rather than being created with a specific purpose over months. Performance data, fabricated but internally consistent. Client testimonials written by people who understood exactly what they were writing and why. A track record that read, to anyone performing the level of due diligence Marcus was capable of, as exactly what we needed it to read. The minimum investment was $3 million. Not a round number chosen randomly, a number chosen because it was precisely at the upper limit of what Marcus could access if he was willing to be creative about where he found it, which we were banking on him being, because Marcus had spent his entire adult life being creative about accessing money that wasn't technically his. The Whisper campaign took 4 months. We didn't approach Marcus directly. Direct approaches of the people who can't afford patience, and I had nothing but time and a very specific objective. I was in no hurry to compromise by moving too fast. Instead, Mr. Vance used a network of carefully positioned intermediaries, people who existed genuinely in the financial and social circles Marcus had been performing membership in for years. People who knew him by name, who had attended some of the same events, who were credible in exactly the way that mattered. The story they told in pieces over 4 months of casual conversations at dinners and golf courses and the kinds of charity functions Marcus attended specifically to be seen attending was this: Obsidian Holdings, extraordinarily selective, not taking new clients, one slot potentially opening up in the next quarter, but the waitlist was significant and the minimum was steep, and frankly, the returns on their real estate consortium were the kind of thing most people in this room would find difficult to believe. The key was never telling Marcus directly. The key was making sure he overheard it, third hand, fourth hand, from people he trusted, which in practice meant people he envied. By the end of month 3, he had approached 2 of our intermediaries himself, asking, casually at first, and then with increasing transparency, whether there was any possibility of an introduction. By the end of month 4, he was asking about the minimum. We let him wait another 3 weeks before Mr. Vance agreed to arrange a meeting. I didn't attend the meeting. I was never going to attend the meeting. Marcus had not seen my face in 3 years, and the new name came with a new professional persona, built around a different enough presentation that casual recognition was unlikely. But I hadn't come this far to risk casual. I was the architect, Mr. Vance was the face. I watched it on a feed from the office's security system, sitting in the car 2 floors below in the parking structure, with a coffee and the particular patience of someone watching a trap they built themselves finally perform its function. The Marcus was wearing a suit that I recognized as new, purchased for this meeting specifically. He'd had his hair done. He sat across from Mr. Durham Vance in the conference room with a performance of casual wealth that he'd been rehearsing his entire life and still hadn't quite gotten right. Because real casual wealth doesn't perform, he asked intelligent questions, which I noted without particular surprise, because Marcus was not stupid, only greedy, and greedy and stupid are not the same thing. He reviewed the portfolio materials with genuine attention. He pushed back on 2 of the projected return figures, which was the right instinct, and Mr. Vance handled it with the precise combination of transparency and confident dismissal that we'd rehearsed specifically for that moment. By the end of the meeting, Marcus believed he was sitting across from a man who was doing him a genuine favor by considering his application at all. He asked how long he had to arrange the minimum. 6 weeks, Mr. Vance said. After that, the slot closes. I knew, because I'd done the math before we set the minimum, that $3 million was not money Marcus had. His investment firm, the one funded with my savings and the sports car and whatever else my mother had managed to redirect over the years, was generating revenue in the approximate range of a moderately successful small business. Not nothing, but not 3 million liquid, not even close. The question was how far he'd go to look like someone who had it. The answer, it turned out, was considerably further than even I had expected. Mr. Vance's investigators tracked the process without interfering in it. A clean documentary record of a man doing exactly what he'd always done, reaching past what was his, towards something that wasn't, and using whatever leverage he could find to close the gap. Marcus went to 3 legitimate lenders first, all 3 declined, correctly identifying that his assets didn't support the exposure he was requesting. He went to 2 private lending arrangements after that, the kind that exist in a formal grey area and charge rates that reflect the risk they're taking. Both funded him partially, not enough. The final piece, the piece that filled the gap and pushed him past the minimum, came from a source his legitimate lenders would not have touched. We didn't arrange it, we didn't suggest it. We had built the trap with a minimum high enough that legitimate funding would fall short for someone in Marcus's position, and Marcus had found the rest himself, through connections he'd apparently cultivated over years of performing a lifestyle that required more money than he had. The syndicate was real, their interest rates were real, their collection practices were, by all available evidence, exactly as real as the rumors about them suggested. Marcus wired $3 million into Obsidian Holdings' offshore account on a Thursday afternoon 6 weeks to the day after the meeting. I watched the transfer confirm on my laptop, sat with it for a moment, This number that had started as my mother's signature on a withdrawal she had no right to make, that had passed through Marcus's hands and then through the hands of people he had no business borrowing from, and had now arrived in a place it was never leaving. I closed the laptop. "It's done," I told Mr. Vance. "Which part?" he said. "All of it," I said. Now we wait 2 weeks. The 2 weeks were the most peaceful I spent in longer than I could accurately measure. Not because I was particularly celebrating, because I had done everything I needed to do and could do nothing further, and there is a specific quality of rest available to people who have finished a thing they worked very hard on and are simply waiting for the last of its consequences to arrive. I read. I slept well, for the first time in years. I had follow-up appointments with a specialist who confirmed, a second time, that my lungs were clear, that the infection had resolved, that the original diagnosis had been, unambiguously, a mistake. "You're going to be fine," she said again. "I know," I said. "I know that now." On the 15th day after the wire transfer, Marcus tried to log into his Obsidian Holdings investor dashboard. The domain returned a 404 error. Not temporarily down, not under maintenance. Simply gone, the way a thing is gone when it has been removed rather than paused. He tried the phone number from the portfolio materials. Disconnected. He called Mr. Vance's personal number, the one that had been a real functioning number for the duration of their relationship, and had, the previous evening, been transferred to a new SIM card in a different city. No answer. He sent 3 emails in the first hour, increasingly unhinged in their escalation, to addresses that were now routing to a server that accepted delivery without returning anything. I know this because Mr. Rafael Vance's team had, among their various capabilities, the ability to monitor the activity around the defunct accounts for exactly this period, specifically so we would know the moment the realization arrived and what form it took when it did. The realization arrived on a Thursday morning. I know it was Thursday because that's when the calls to the syndicate started. Not from Marcus. To Marcus? The syndicate, it turned out, had their own monitoring system for clients who had recently wired a significant sum to a counterparty that no longer appeared to exist, which was apparently a pattern they had encountered before and had developed procedures around. Their first call to Marcus lasted 4 minutes. Their second call, 2 hours later, lasted 11. By Friday morning, Marcus had communicated to his mother that there was a situation. I don't know exactly what words he used. I know the outcome. My mother spent Friday trying to liquidate the sports car which Marcus had apparently, and quietly pawned the title on 3 months earlier to cover a cash flow gap in his legitimate business, and which therefore could not be sold by anyone whose name was on the registration, because the title no longer was. She found this out at 2:30 on a Friday afternoon. The syndicate's collection team arrived at 6. The SUVs came without announcement, 4 of them, black, pulling up to the front of the house in the kind of coordinated, purposeful formation that communicates to anyone watching that the people inside them have a specific task and have performed similar tasks before. My mother heard the engines from inside. I know this because the curtain in the front window moved before the first door opened. Marcus was already on the phone with someone when they knocked. Not a lawyer, not the police. Someone he apparently believed could help him negotiate, which told me everything about the quality of his judgment under pressure. The negotiation, if it could be called that, lasted less than 20 minutes. By 6:40, Marcus was on the front steps with 2 suitcases that didn't contain nearly enough of what he'd need for wherever he was going. And my mother was standing on the porch in the cold in her good coat, still holding her phone, still scrolling through contacts for someone who hadn't yet heard about the situation and might still be willing to help. It was raining. Of course it was raining. I had asked my driver to wait until this exact moment, and when he looked at me in the rear-view mirror with the familiar question in his eyes, I said simply, "Now." The Rolls-Royce pulled to the curb, though my mother recognized the car before the window came down. I'd known she would. The vehicle had appeared in the financial press twice in the last 8 months. Once in a profile of emerging corporate figures that Mr. Philplafe Vance had carefully arranged, once in a photo spread from a charity event that positioned Obsidian Holdings as exactly the kind of serious, established entity that would make a greedy man want to invest his borrowed money in it. Though my mother had seen this second piece specifically because Marcus had shown it to her, pointing out the car in the background of one photograph as evidence of the kind of company he was about to be associated with, so she knew the car. What she didn't know, couldn't have known, was why it was parked at her curb on a Friday night in the rain with her son's suitcases being deposited in the mud and 2 debt collectors standing on her porch with clipboards. The window came down. I watched through the opening as my mother's face moved through its sequence. The confusion, first the rapid processing of a familiar vehicle in an impossible context. Then the recognition, slower than it should have been, the specific delay of a brain that has decided something is impossible and is therefore taking longer than usual to accept the evidence in front of it. Then, finally, understanding it. Not full understanding. Not yet. Not enough. Her hand went to her mouth. The phone she'd been scrolling through dropped to her side. Forgotten. Marcus turned from where he'd been standing at the edge of the porch, jaw set, still performing the posture of a man who has options. Even when every option is posed around him, he looked at the car the way he'd looked at me in the doorway 3 years ago, before I understood what that look meant. Calculation first, then adjustment. Then, as his eyes found the face in the window and his brain made the same slow journey my mother's had just made, something I hadn't seen in his face before. Genuine fear. Not the performed discomfort of a man being inconvenienced. Fear. The physical, involuntary kind that starts somewhere in the body before the mind is fully caught up. I'd spent 3 years imagining what I would say to them in this moment. I had prepared, at various points, speeches, arguments, precise, devastating inventories of everything they had taken, and everything it had cost, and everything I had built from the ruins of what they'd left me with. I had written versions of this confrontation in my head during clinic nights and during the first months of building Obsidian, when the work was still abstract and the outcome still uncertain, and the act of imagining this moment had been one of the things that kept everything moving forward. The sitting in that car, looking at my mother's face and Marcus's face in the rain, I found I didn't want to say any of it. Not because I'd forgiven them. I want to be precise about that, because I think the story wants a forgiveness that didn't arrive and isn't coming. I hadn't forgiven them. I don't think I was going to. But the speeches had been written for a version of me that still needed them to understand, that still needed to be believed, to be acknowledged, to have the full account of what they'd done read back to them in language they couldn't deny. I didn't need that anymore. I reached into the pocket of my coat and took out the paper I'd been carrying since the clinic. The false positive diagnosis, folded, creased, the edges soft from 5 years of occasional handling, the document that said I was dying, that they had used as permission to spend my money and lock my door and throw a party while I sat in the rain on their front step. I held it out into the rain. It landed in the mud of my mother's feet. She looked down at it, then up at me. I rolled the window up. "Airport," I said to my driver. He pulled away from the curb without comment. I didn't look back. I want to be honest about that too, because it's a small thing and it matters. I genuinely didn't look back. Not from discipline or from a decision I made in the moment, simply because there was nothing behind me I needed to see anymore. There was a thing I learned during 3 years of building Obsidian from a clinic cot and a borrowed phone and a new name about the difference between justice and revenge. Revenge is about the other person. It requires their suffering to be witnessed, to be understood, to be connected back to you. It requires them to know it was you. It requires a reaction. What I had built wasn't quite that. Marcus knew it was me, yes. My mother knew it was me, yes. My mother knew. But I hadn't stayed to watch the reaction. I hadn't needed the speech or the confrontation or the moment of them understanding, the full architecture of everything I'd done. I'd dropped a piece of paper in the mud and driven away, and the mud and the rain and the men with clipboards had done the rest. That felt, to me, more like justice than revenge. Justice doesn't need an audience, it just needs to be real. I found out through Mr. Vance's network what happened after I drove away. The syndicate's team was efficient. They were inside the house within the hour, conducting the specific, methodical inventory that people in their profession conduct when a debt is being settled in assets rather than currency. The cars, the furniture, the electronics, the jewelry my mother had been collecting since before I was born, piece by piece, estimated and removed, the total falling short of $3 million in a way that was going to have consequences. Marcus was gone by morning. Through any dramatic escape, no one chased him out. He simply wasn't there when the syndicate team returned the following day with additional documentation, and inquiries to people who knew him produced consistent answers that added up to he left. He didn't say where. He didn't say where. He didn't say when he'd be back. He had abandoned my mother in the house while the inventory was still being conducted. I found this out on a Tuesday. sitting in my New York office with coffee and a view that cost more per square foot than my entire original apartment, and I sat with it for a moment, this specific detail. Marcus leaving my mother to face the consequences of a plan he had built, exactly the way he had left me to face the consequences of a night he had engineered. There was a particular satisfaction available in symmetry when you didn't arrange the symmetry yourself. It arrives with a quality that manufactured symmetry doesn't carry. I noted it, set it down, moved on. For my mother, I was told, had spent 2 nights in the house after the bulk of the inventory was complete, in a building that had been stripped of most of what had made it feel like hers, before a final notice from the syndicate's legal representative made clear that her residential status in the property had formally ended. She had called Marcus's number approximately 40 times across those 2 days. He didn't answer. I want to note that I felt something when I heard this. Not pleasure, exactly. Something more complicated. The specific, complicated feeling of watching someone discover that the person they chose over you is not, in the end, the person they believed they were choosing. While my mother had spent her entire adult life curating Marcus, protecting Marcus, investing in Marcus, redirecting resources toward Marcus and away from me, because she believed Marcus was the kind of person worth that investment. He was in a motel outside the city, paying cash, not answering his phone. She was standing in an empty house in the rain. That information cost me nothing to receive and gave me very little I could call satisfaction. It was simply true, and true in a way that didn't require me to have arranged it. The flight to New York boarded at 9:50. I had a window seat, which I'd chosen because I wanted the view, not for any sentimental reason, but because high-altitude clouds at night have a quality of complete, indifferent beauty that I have always found useful for thinking. My flight attendant brought champagne before takeoff. I held a glass without drinking it for a while, looking at the gate, at the ground crew moving in their orange vests, at the lights of the terminal doing what airport lights do at night, which is make everything look simultaneously temporary and significant. I thought about a savings account I'd built from 30% over a decade, about a door that used to take my key, about a DOI diagnosis in a paper cup and a clinic cot and a phone call to a man who said, "I have time, tell me everything." I thought about Marcus's face when the window came down, the specific quality of the fear on it, the kind that comes not from the mob outside your door, but from the realization that the person you left to die in the rain built something large enough and patient enough and precisely calibrated enough to reach you years later on a Friday night in exactly the same rain. I thought about the paper in the mud, the false positive, the document that had started all of it, that had been the instrument of my family's cruelty and eventually the instrument of my own exit from everything they had tried to make me into. The plane began to move. I took a sip of the champagne. It was very good. The kind of good that exists at altitudes and price points I had taken a long time to reach and had no intention of leaving. Out the window, the city was shrinking, its grid becoming abstract, the specific geography of everything that had happened there resolving into patterns too large to read up close. I watched it go with the feeling of someone who has finished something long and difficult and is, for the first time in a very long time, simply going home. Home was a penthouse in Manhattan with a view I'd chosen myself, and furniture nobody else had picked, and a refrigerator stocked according to what I actually liked rather than what was left after everyone else had taken what they wanted. Same with Obsidian Holdings and the work of turning a phantom firm built for a single purpose into something real and growing and mine, which Mr. Abysant, Vance and A had been doing quietly for the last several months, the shell becoming substance, the trap becoming a legitimate enterprise with legitimate clients and a track record that was no longer fabricated because it didn't need to be. Home was not a family. That was the part that had taken the longest to accept, and that I had, somewhere over the last 3 years, finally accepted completely. Not bitterly. That's the thing I want to get right about how it felt on that plane, looking at a city getting smaller in the dark. Not bitterly, and not with grief, and not with the specific ache of something lost, because you can only grieve the loss of something that existed, and what I'd been given in that family had never been what I'd believed it was. I had spent 28 years giving them 60, 70, 80% of everything I had, and they had taken it and called it insufficient, and asked for the rest, and I'd nearly given them the rest too, the savings, the emergency funds, the last reserve of a person who had been systematically emptied for years, except they'd gotten there first and taken it themselves. And in taking it, they had accidentally given me back the thing they'd been taking all along. My own life, undivided, finally, completely irreversibly mine. The champagne was finished somewhere over the mountains. The flight attendant offered another glass, and I said yes, which felt like the right answer for a night like this, and sat back against the headrest and looked at the dark outside the window where the city had been, and felt, for the first time in a very long time, the specific quality of peace that comes not from the absence of difficulty, but from the knowledge that the difficulty is genuinely, permanently over. My phone had one unread message from Mr. Vance, sent while I was in the car. It said, "Clean. All accounts closed and redirected. No traces. Or a ghost again, if you want to be." I typed back, "Not a ghost anymore, the mayor." He replied with a single period, which was his way of saying he understood, and I put the phone in my bag and looked out the window at nothing in particular and let the plane carry me home.